one of the technical assistant specialists for the Grand Families and Kinship Support Network. You may know that typically Melissa Devlin is here and Marina Nitsa, and both of them are not able to be here today, but we have a great agenda lined up, and I'm really excited about it. So today, leading the discussion is Emma Craig and Linda Blancato with the Government Performance Lab. Emma and Linda will be using time today to facilitate conversation with several counties and states who are successfully using strategies on never stopping looking for kin. So I'm going to pass it over to them to lead today's discussion. Before I do that, I do want to remind everyone that our next meeting will be in 2 weeks, which is October 10th. It is wild that we are already into October, but we are at 1 p.m. Eastern. So I am going to pass it over to you, Emma and Linda.
Thank you, Kylie. And I am with you. As I was making these slides and wrote the word October, I was like, oh my goodness, how is this possible? But here we are. I hope everyone is having a great day and speaking of, doing some nice fall things. I am Emma Craig. I work with the Government Performance Lab, or the GPL, as we like to call it. And before we jump in today and get started, I'm going to very quickly share a little bit about what we do at the GPL and our work in kinship care. Just to give us a bit of grounding, the GPL is a research organization, an applied research organization out of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. We are spread out as a team across the entire country, and we support governments in building more just and effective service systems. We do this by working very closely, shoulder to shoulder, with folks in state and local governments, and that could be agency leaders, managers, frontline staff, across the board in developing and testing new practices to drive change, to figure out what works. We do this in a lot of different areas. We have folks working in homelessness and rehousing efforts, criminal justice reform. I and and also Linda, who's joining us by phone today. The two of us, we work on the children and families team, and kinship care is one of the areas that we focus on and really see as such an important component when we think about supporting folks in child welfare and building and testing new things, and thinking about how to change existing systems. We've just seen kinship as an area where there's a wealth of opportunity to think about, all right, as we're developing kin first policies, how do we translate that to practice change in the day-to-day to support our staff to be able to prioritize placements with kin and to support kinship families. And so we do this work in a lot of different ways, but as we support jurisdictions in testing and trying and learning about what's working in those practice changes, we love the opportunity to get to share and elevate what we're learning, both in formal ways like a publication, in peer-to-peer spaces like this. And it's so fun when I get to do this, but it's even more fun when our governments get to share what they're doing and learning. And so really excited to have folks from 3 different jurisdictions that we worked with today share out about their Kin First efforts. And specifically, as we support folks in thinking about practice changes and building a Kin First system, we recognize that the efforts to continue to search for kin, right, thinking about building and maintaining an ongoing kin search momentum can be really tough. And it makes sense at the point, following a placement where a child is not initially placed with kin, they are safe and there's a lot going on for team members when they're thinking about managing the caseload. There's lots of competing pieces and factors. So how do we make this possible and create and maintain that momentum, supporting staff and teams in continuing to search for kin? Also, when we think about challenges here, we often hear from jurisdictions that, at this point, there's been or there might be multiple case handoffs, multiple folks involved on a case, and as a result, information on children and families on their network might not get passed along or only in part. And as a result, staff are ending up having to ask the same questions, and oftentimes of families. And so families are having to go through that same process or conversation once again. So these are things that we identified as challenges and thought, all right, what can we do here? And some approaches that we've seen jurisdictions test and that they're going to share about today is thinking about one, like we just named, one of the biggest challenges is this is hard in the sense that managing a case and all the caseload requirements take a lot of time. So how can we leverage existing checkpoints to continue to check in, utilizing existing check-in points with staff and managers to build in accountability mechanisms and support mechanisms to help continue to look for kin and bust those challenges if a kin placement couldn't happen at first, figuring out how can we move that child into kinship care. And then similarly, how are we thinking about ongoing points of contacts with the family as kin search opportunities? How do we keep coming back to those conversations, but have them in different ways over time? How do we think about talking with parents, with youth themselves, even with resource families about ongoing kin search? And then also, so we're going to talk about today, sometimes we see success in structuring something a little bit more formal, something like a formal case review process of kin placement or of non-kin placement. So anytime that a placement isn't made with kin initially, coming together to speak more formally about, okay, why didn't this happen? What can we do next? What barriers can we bust? What do we need to elevate to leadership? What can we walk out of this meeting with as really clear next steps? What will it take to move this child into care? And let's come back and reconvene and talk about this in X number of days. So these are some examples. Like I mentioned, we have folks from 3 different jurisdictions talking with us today, and the bulk of our time today is just going to be a Q&A format where folks are sharing about their efforts in this area. So really encourage you all as we're chatting and as I'm asking folks questions for you to do the same. And if you would like to drop questions in the chat, I'll manage that as well. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen right away. I'd much rather look at all of your faces. But as I do this, I want to say we're going to go in this order and hear from Sherry Totora in Broward County, Florida, Diana Schreckengast and Valerie Moore from San Diego County, and then Jennifer Ulmer is joining us from the great state of Michigan. So I'm going to pass the mic over. Let's see, Sherry, trying to make eye contact with you.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi. Great to see you, Sherry. To get us started in talking about your team's work in Broward County, I would love to hear whether any of these challenges that I just talked through, what resonates with you here? Where have you seen challenges in building and maintaining momentum around ongoing kin search? And how are you encouraging staff to keep identifying and reaching out to kin?
Yeah, well, we definitely see this and more at the work that we do at ChildNet. I think it'll be best if I talk about it maybe in 3 main areas. So I'm going to cover some things we've learned from data, ongoing discussions, and training. So starting with data first, one of the things that we've done is from our data, we were able to determine that some management lines were making it more of a priority than others, or some specialized units face challenges by just the nature of the cases that they carry. So to keep the momentum going for the children initially placed in licensed care, our quality staff member responsible for data and reports made significant changes to the way our kinship report is sent out. This is a weekly data report that's emailed to our case management directors, and it now shows the number of children placed in kinship placements, along with the number that are still needed to achieve that goal. Our goal is 60% or higher for each unit. From this view, we were able to clearly see what units were performing well, what units are having those challenges that we want to talk more about. What units are making some progress towards that goal, and then learning from each of those things. So that's been really exciting. That's a fairly recent change. So it may be too early to see where it's taking us, but we're seeing that it's trending in the right direction. So really excited about that.
That's awesome. And 60%, that's a great goal.
Yes, that is the goal actually set by Florida too. So another ongoing strategy is just really encouraging staff to use every meeting as a chance to ask about family connections. So not just who can we place these kids with, but who are their connections. This simple message seems to be sticking because recently we've been receiving feedback from our leadership and their observations of these various staffings that we have, whether it's a staffing about timely permanency or a group care reduction, indicates that our teams are really fully embracing this activity and the conversations have shifted to be truly focused on kin search and support efforts. I recently learned of a large sibling group where finding relatives has really been a challenge, but there's a church involved. So true collaboration is taking place right now between multiple professionals to weigh out the options of being able to place with this church member. So more so than not, this is what it means, and this is what it takes to keep looking for kin. And then finally, training. So since training also plays a crucial role in overcoming these challenges that you talked about, we have implemented ongoing training opportunities for our staff. But we started this project by first having roundtable discussions with directors and managers about their kin first management techniques before rolling it out to staff. We know that our leaders will be the ones that are driving these changes that we want to see at the unit levels. And we really wanted there to be an opportunity to have honest discussion, to talk about any biases, challenges, and as well as like starting the conversation about what success means for us. So that's been really exciting.
That's really cool. So I hear you saying like you stepped in and you did those different levels. You built that buy-in in terms of, and like it sounds like they have a lot of ownership in this process as a result.
Definitely.
That's really cool. And I didn't know that story with about your efforts with or placing with a member of the church. And I love you're highlighting I like we talked about this being challenging and it's nice to have folks come together support, but also like the level of like creativity that you can do as a team or a group and thinking about kin and fictive kin options and how to work together to make something work. That's really cool.
Yes.
So these examples that you're talking through, are these practices, you talked about this a little bit already, but I'm curious, so are these built into existing meetings generally, checkpoints, or any of these how did you fit these new processes into what you're already doing day to day?
Well, actually, one of our long-standing practices in Broward County and ChildNet to really focus in on the kin measure is our biweekly report card meeting. We call it our report card meeting, but it's reviewing our performance. We do have champions assigned to each of the measures that we track, but there is a measure just dedicated to kinship alone. And those champions are really wonderful. I can't talk about them enough. We probably don't have enough time here to talk about them, but they are just wonderful and they take the lead. They are the lead role on that measure and driving performance improvement. And they come from all levels of our agency and they're just wonderful for the work that they do because it is extra work. But they really report out on what our performance is and what are those action steps that we're taking to improve. And this is an agency-wide meeting. Everyone is invited. So it does present yet another opportunity to keep that conversation going and so that it can remain a priority for everyone. And actually in this meeting that I just mentioned, the report card meeting, recently there was a push or a challenge put out to everyone that maybe we should just focus on a case or two per unit. I know I mentioned the weekly kinship report that went out by unit. So this goes right alongside with that concept, but really finding ways to make it less overwhelming, show that even one thing like, achieving a placement with kin for one family within one unit can still make a really big difference. So we asked ourselves, what would it look like to just move one child or one sibling group this month or this quarter? And as the kinship champion said in Palm Beach today, he explained it really well. It's just about narrowing the focus, that sometimes that can make a difference.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. That's such a creative, like in relation to folks feeling overwhelmed and this can feel change is hard. And like if we're talking about something new or something different, narrowing the focus. And even if it's just that's one family or one sibling group, one child's experience. That's huge. That's really, and are you seeing that you said that's kind of new? And say, are you seeing that work in terms of the mindset, like with folks on the ground, or that feels folks are convening around talking about one placement or one family, and that feels more approachable to have that conversation, thinking about just a single placement change at a time.
Definitely, I think so. And like you said, it's about building that buy-in with staff. And one of the things that we've done to work on that is, we have our report card champions, but we also have tried to build within our agency just people that are going to be our kinship champions. And that's across all departments because this is not something that case management can just do alone. So we have people that are considered to be like the go-to people for kinship. In operations department, our quality department, even intake and placement and licensing. And that's just to name a few, but we are really trying to build that up. We also have a kinship strategic action plan. It's actually been in place now for 1 year as of this month. And that plan, we have meetings that go along with that plan. So we have regular meetings of the kinship work group, and everyone is also invited to come to those. We feel like that's great too for buy-in and understanding too, so people kind of know what's going on and where we're headed. But we've really collected so many ideas from different people from different departments attending those meetings. Everything from identifying that we had a need to update some protocols or staffing forms to really capture what we want to capture when we're having these kinship conversations. And also things like streamlining the home study process. Another thing that we did is we recently had like a special 1 hour virtual. We still do a lot of our meetings virtual. That was also open to everyone. We just thought that we wanted to kind of refocus and reignite our efforts for kinship. So in that meeting, we took the time to cover what our current performance looked like for our some of the targeted reviews that we've done on kinship. We reminded staff about our internal SharePoint site for kin resources. We have everything on there from forms to different places that they can access information. And then we reviewed the action plan with everyone. So that meeting was really well attended. It was not a mandatory meeting, but we got a lot of good participation. And like you said, it's really just about those frequent reminders. You can't talk about this enough. So.
Yeah, like what I'm hearing you say, it's the building the momentum, but continuing to ignite and reignite that momentum and this stuff takes time. And so that's really cool. And that's great to hear that you had such receptivity, even a year later time, like you're building, it's going. And also it sounds like you've put these things in, they didn't all happen at once. You've chosen different times to introduce new things slowly and kind of let it snowball. Does that feel accurate or right to say?
Yeah, I mean, an example of that would be that that data report that I talked about earlier. We used to have we had a data report that went out weekly, but it was more like a listing report. So that was something that we introduced later on. When your information's out there about how your unit is doing specifically compared to the other units, it can feel a little hard at first, but eventually we heard from managers that they wanted that information. They needed it to be able to better follow up with their staff and their teams. And we've had a lot of good feedback about it, but that was something that we adjusted as we continue to roll out our improvement efforts.
Yeah, that's really cool. Or that's a great example in terms of folks being like, oh, that's, that is a lot of, or can feel like a lot of pressure to think about things being reported by management line. But then to go from folks giving that feedback to saying, oh, no, wait, actually, now that we're doing this, we want this, it's going to help us further improve. That's a big shift. That's amazing.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, that's great. I want to, before we move on, make sure that if folks have questions for Sherry about anything she just shared, feel free to drop in the chat or come off mute. And as that's happening, Jada, I saw your comment in here specifically about how in these examples, a great idea in terms of, as we're talking about encouraging staff to search and identify family, thinking about ways to build that into supervision, discussion points in existing meetings. So just wanted to reiterate, you kind of talked about some of those examples throughout, Sherry, but yes, Jada, I think that's a great way to build on existing practices and check-ins. Any questions for Sherry?
I did put my information in the chat, and you're welcome to reach out if you needed anything further.
Thank you, Sherry. And thank you, Broward County folks. I see a couple of you. Awesome. Well, let's switch gears to the other side, to the other coast, another beach town. Diana and Valerie are joining us from San Diego County. Hey, y'all.
Hi, I'd say good morning, but I know half of you it's not morning anymore. It is for us.
That's true.
And so I specifically asked for Valerie to join me today because I am the chief over all of our ongoing programs, which means anyone who has a case open in San Diego County is with my team. But I used to be a placement supervisor, and I know how essential placement supervisors are to our kin searches. So I wanted to have Valerie kind of piggyback off of what I was saying. So you may hear us kind of talk over each other when we get excited. That tends to happen with us. But it's just because we have a big passion for this. And what Sherry said really resonated with me as far as our data. We have our key data report that we're constantly looking at to see our placement numbers with kin. And we have a lot of other strategies that we've used. But one thing that I've really reflected on recently is how the pandemic kind of caused practice drift. So I was a placement supervisor prior to the pandemic, and Valerie's been one since the pandemic and on. And so we were just kind of comparing notes on things that are happening. And I understand it. We had so many different competing priorities and emergencies that were happening during those 4 years of the pandemic of shift and staffing crises that were happening, that some of those best practices were not occurring. And so I can kind of talk through some of the things that we're doing now to get us back there and some of the great work that Valerie's team is doing as well. I think one of the things that really resonates with me is, and I think about everything on that micro, meso, macro level. So if we're thinking really micro and what things that we can shift, for me, it's making sure that our workers have the tools to ask the inquiry for our to our families. So our workers, I teach a class at San Diego State, and I see where our workers are before they're getting into our workforce. And they're all coming in with their own worldviews. They're coming in with that implicit and sometimes explicit bias. And it's the things that we have to kind of work against, that those phrases of the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, or parents don't deserve this, like all of those different things can really culminate into us not searching for relatives and kin placements. I've heard our workers say, but the foster family is so great with a kid and they'll have a great life. And they're not considering what a great opportunity and identity and culture it is to have your family. So it's constantly working against that, but you can't do that without having the questions, without getting the training. So when Sherry was talking about the training too, I think it goes all the way down to that micro level with our workers and saying, here's some questions to try on. These might not be questions that you thought about before. This might not be the approach that you were thinking, but all of the great collective minds within our workforce and those who have been seasoned workers can then teach the new workers some of those strategies and questions to ask. Some that they may not have thought of, like I didn't think of, okay, who's on your social media, or who's your emergency contact, until someone told me. And so coming together with all of those great kin finding questions and making sure that as seasoned workers, we're not assuming that our workforce is coming in with those tools to be successful. And then some are more comfortable with it than others, right? Some of them are feeling more comfortable with those questions.
I was going to ask, how do you think about, I think, yes, great point and so true. How do you think about that specifically in relation to continuing to ask or continuing to follow up? Does that resonate, or is that like specific things that feel extra challenging or different there?
I think that, so I think of it as with our initial placements all the way through to our ongoing. So one of the things that Valerie and I talked about this morning is we talked about if a child is placed in a home, then it's not a kin home. How are we asking the workers to ask the family for those questions too? So we're talking through it with, great, they're in a home. I'm glad that they're stable. And where are we at with finding those kinship placements? What does that look like? What are the questions you can ask the family? What are the questions you can ask the parents within those one-on-one meetings, or the families within those child and family team meetings to say, okay, great, I'm glad that they're stable, that they're thriving, and where are we at with aunts? How is this looking with your neighbors, your non-relative extended family members? Valerie, did you have anything else you wanted to add with it?
Yeah, definitely. I've I promoted during the pandemic, and you had to, the new normal was everything virtual whiteboard and keeping track of kids that need placement. But initially, when I get we get an email that says, "Hey, heads up, kids coming into custody." I'm like, "What's the name, date of birth, and do you have any relatives or non-relative extended family members?" And we keep that ongoing, so they know the questions that we're going to ask. And it may be, "Hey, we haven't even talked to mom, but we're going to get some information," and it comes right back. If they give us 5 names, which one do we want to, consider for placement? And then I will pre-screen. If they say, "Well, this person's got some criminal history," because I came from resource RFA approval, I will pre-screen and be like, "This is not going to fly for an emergency. Who next can we apply?" So it's just an ongoing supportive relationship with the regional social workers, because they're so busy that we get to take the brunt of that work and that casework, so that we can say, "Hey, we've got this. We're moving it forward." I've done road shows in units, meetings, that this is what placement, help us help you. And so for them to know that if you're breathing a removal, your email should go to county. If you're talking to county council, your next email should be to placement. So we can proactively look for relative or fictive kin placements and get them cleared before that kid comes into care. And if not, that there's an ongoing discussion of, "Hey, we've got this kid that needs placement. We're going to CFTs. We're going to multiple child and family team meetings, multiple disciplinary team meetings," and just constantly bringing that to the forefront of, like, "Have you found a relative or NEFRM to consider, or fictive kin?" So
Yeah. I learned NEFRM is fictive kin in California. For anyone on the call, I learned this by working in California. It's always interesting hearing the terminology. But I love what I'm hearing you say there, Valerie. That's so great in terms of highlighting one. You're from the beginning, like to your example, you've got 5 folks that you're building out that network early on and thinking about that family's network. And so also in the case that initial placement is not with kin or not possible right away, one, in terms of your example of one placement option not working and then following up, but also just generally in terms of keeping that larger network plugged in and continuing to be able to tap in or ask about placement if initial placement doesn't happen. Which I think is awesome. And then also I love this roadshow idea. I love the idea of like just all the different ways you all are getting creative as a large county with a lot of programs and groups, and thinking about how to continue to show up and offer support for your staff and continue to reinforce, and also show practically how you're supporting, right, what you're doing for frontline staff, especially I would imagine new team members who, they're learning a lot of things. This is one of many things that they're gathering and trying to place in relation to a lot of work responsibilities. So offering that support as proactively and as tangibly as possible.
I think that's one of our biggest thing is keeping it top of mind and showing the worth and the importance of the other team members, building those relationships, because oftentimes our workers feel like it's another thing instead of like it's something else I have to do. And then they have all those competing priorities that can feel very overwhelming. But as soon as a placement team like Valerie's team can get in there and say, "We are here to support you. And if you can give us 2 bits of data," or once our family finders come on, maybe not even that much, they're going to be scouring those the case history, that they can really see them as a support, and then building those networks, that relationship within kind of that meso piece of it, to be able to show workers, "Hey, you don't have to do this alone. This is one of our top priorities in San Diego, is to make sure that we have children with their family. And this is how we're going to help support you in doing it." And I think just constantly keeping that top of mind is really important to reduce the drift.
That's really good. I have another question, but I also feel like you had other things you were going to say and I cut you off. So
No, you're fine. Ask the question and I'll piggyback on whatever.
Okay. I was curious in terms of in these examples, some of this is new, some of this is just going back to or reminding and reinforcing these different examples, though. It's not like, it's hard, like change is hard, change takes time. I'm curious about like the buy-in piece, or thinking about ways that you're since you talked about some of those challenging mindsets, or like you're coming into some conversation with folks who aren't all thinking about this work the same way, if you just have any ideas of how to further build and buy-in around specifically continuing to look for kin.
And that's funny because I think that does piggyback into that macro level piece of it. I posed the questions when you gave them to me. I posed a lot of these questions over to our managers in our ongoing team, and I said, let me know from your perspective. So, like you said, San Diego County is a very large county, and I have 5 managers that are working with teams within San Diego, all on the same ongoing work. And a lot of them, what their response was, is we don't need buy-in from them. This is a passion. And I think that speaks volume of our leadership team because it is a passion to them. And whether or not it was in the beginning, it's that force of your leadership, sets the tone for everyone else. And the leaders that we have in place in our ongoing team and in Valerie's team in placement express that kin is important. Kin is where we're going to go, and this is where what we need to do. Not to say that there isn't drift or there isn't. Sometimes there's the outliers, but I think that the general force of those talking about it, those passionate about it, can kind of shift the mindset, and we can kind of work against that, right? So I think that a lot of times it's what is our leadership saying is important. And I think that as long as our leadership continues to remind, continues to look at the data, because I think we can say what we're doing, but our data is going to show what we're doing. And so the leaders have the pulse on that data to say, okay, how can we move this forward? What isn't, this is important to us. There's only 15 key data points or whatever, and it's one of them. So how do we get back to where we were before some of the competing priorities and barriers occurred, with the way that RFA changed the landscape of how we were approving, then the pandemic changed the landscape of how we were doing business. I think going back to some of those initial strategies, like you said, will continue to help with buy-in. And I think when you hear success stories, like we try really hard to highlight all the success stories. It's the reason people got into social work, to help, to make sure that we're, helping kids thrive and be safe. And I think that when you hear about it with their relatives and how, the kids got to be in a familiar environment from night one and how much that reduced their trauma, I think that also continues to add that buy-in.
Can I piggyback off of that? Being from the placement side of it, and looking at relatives, and you'll get a worker who will say, well, I've got an adult sister who lives in a studio apartment and she wants her 3 brothers. And I'm like, how do we make it happen? We order stuff from Kinship, who gets stuff from Amazon. They deliver partitions to divide the room, the beds, everything that we can to support these relatives who before, when RFA first started, that wouldn't have been a go. You can't have all these people in a single room. Now with, SB 354 and Kin First culture, how can we shift it? And what can we put around, surround this family with to make this work? With childcare resources, mentors, and really thinking outside the box with relatives. Like I said, also pre-screening people who've got, I call it creative or colorful history, right? They're coming with some baggage. What can we do to read that history and see if it was a long time ago? Can we move forward and partner with our RFA team to get these kids placed with relatives? So there's much more of the shift. And like Diana said, with our leadership is really supportive and really a big push on Kin First culture and those Kin First placements. And what can we do to get that those placements successful, if it not the first placement, as soon after, so that they can be in a familiar environment.
Those are great examples. Thank you both. And I dropped this in the chat, but also RFA is California's licensing process, which the state of California license resource families and relative caregivers, everyone similarly, and they go through the same process. And so I think that's so key. And what you're all describing, right, is really, thinking about how do we continue to make that happen for our relative caregivers. Those are great examples. We are kind of at time, but I want to make sure that I didn't see any in the chat, but does anyone have a question for Valerie or Diana before we shift over to the great state of Michigan? Okay, thank you both so much. I'm going to call on Jennifer next from Michigan. Jennifer, thank you for joining us today and being willing to share out a little bit from a state perspective about what you all are doing as a Michigan DHHS team. And really curious if you could tell us a little bit more about how your teams are encouraging staff to keep identifying and reaching out to kin.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me this afternoon. One of the biggest things that we have been doing in Michigan is we have been doing kinship care meetings for a couple of years now. So we take the data, we identify when kids initially come into care and they are not placed with kin caregivers of any kind. And so we have a monthly meeting where the kids who were not placed with kin initially are put on that agenda, and we go through and identify what the barriers to placing with kin were, if there are any potential leads that we need to further follow up on and explore, who else we can be contacting. We also pull in people who are able to assist with doing the paid relative searches that we have access to figure out why weren't these kids placed with kin, and what are we able to do to eliminate those barriers, to identify people who we hadn't previously come across, to try to find ways to place those kids with kin. It's so easy in CPS because the focus is on safety, and it's so easy to just move from crisis to crisis all the time, that it is easy for things that seem secondary in importance, which are not really secondary in importance at all, but it's easy for them to, once a kid is safe in a placement, to go, okay, the kid's good. I don't need to worry about placement anymore. And so for anything placement related to kind of fall onto the back burner. And we have the data that shows how much better kids do who are placed in kin. They have less placement disruptions. They're more stable in the placement. They have better mental health outcomes. And so it's really, really critical work, but it's so easy for it to be put on the back burner. And so we've been utilizing the kinship care meetings as kind of a opportunity to force it to be at the forefront and to bring it back to everyone's attention that, hey, okay, this kid wasn't placed with kin. What can we do to try to make that happen? And that's not to say in every instance that we are able to accomplish that, but there's been a lot of scenarios where we have thankfully been able to identify some kin who wasn't identified initially and have been able to make some placements happen as a result of that. And so it's encouraging to see that we're actually being successful, at least with some kids.
Yes, I'm curious, do you have a story that you could share with us, about one of those existence? I'm curious just to hear how you think that having a more formalized or set check-in where you're discussing this, what that often unearths or what that might lead to that could look different if you're not having that regular check-in.
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of families. There's one in particular that really sticks out in my mind because I swear we had this family on the agenda for probably a solid 6 months, and there was a lot of months where we saw no movement. But the kids actually had a maternal grandmother who had been contacted by CPS during the investigation. There was 4 kids. The kids did have some needs, mental health and behavioral stuff, and they were like a wide gap between their age ranges. So there was a lot going on with these kids. And initially, grandma had been like, no, I'm too old. I don't think I can do it. I'm not up for it. And so she had initially declined to be assessed for placement. And so we had looked at other placement leads. We're striking out with everyone else that we were contacting. And so kind of out of desperation, decided to circle back to grandma and work with grandma to see, okay, what can we do to put services in place to get some supports in the home for the kids and for grandma. Also, there was some safety issues with grandma's housing that had to be addressed. And so we were able to utilize our kinship staff who do have some funds available to, it's kind of pretty open for funding to eliminate some of the safety barriers that existed in grandma's home. But this was one of those cases where if we had not had so many different people coming together to brainstorm and come up with some creative different ideas, that I don't know that we would have been able to make this work for this family, because there was just a lot going on and we had to get pretty creative and think outside the box. And we were ultimately able to place the kids with grandma, and they're still there. But I definitely, if we had not had so many people involved coming together, trying to be creative in our approach to how we could make this happen, I don't know if we'd had a formalized process to do that. That without that, I don't know that we would have been able to pull together the resources that were needed to make this doable for that family.
That's a great example of that collaborative nature. That's an amazing. That's also a great example of, I know that's not even your point here, but I'm struck by also just time, right? That like sometimes this is something we haven't talked about that much, but I think about in the sense of an ongoing kin search and placement opportunities for folks not everyone is ready to take or placement initially, right? They might want to be involved in other ways, but obviously that's a huge responsibility and step. And that's something that generally our kinship caregivers are being asked to do on a moment's notice and haven't had that time to prepare. So I know you weren't saying this explicitly, but I'm also struck by the, like initially that wasn't possible, but later on, and to your example, out of desperation, but also possibly just out of time passing, the situation changing, a good reminder to us of, placement options and opportunities, and how relatives are thinking about this might have changed as well.
Well, and we see so many times where, I mean, it is such an emotional time at the time of removal. Like tensions are high, everyone's emotional. And a lot of times we'll see relatives who are just overwhelmed, are frustrated, they're angry, not at the kids, but usually at the kids' parents, who are oftentimes their child, their brother, their sister. And it just seems like too much in that moment to take on the task of raising these kids for whatever length of time. And so sometimes we need some time for tensions to kind of simmer a little bit, things to cool off, everyone to be in a little bit less emotional of a place. And I feel like without our kinship meetings, that's the kind of stuff that very easily just gets lost in translation, because you get focused on them getting their treatment plan from the court and working that treatment plan, and foster care is focused on the day-to-day needs of the kids and what is needed there, that we forget about those relatives who initially were identified and potentially circling back to see if their feelings have changed and see if that's something that they're willing to consider. And also, we've been trying to enforce with our staff, like just because someone says no to placement, that doesn't mean they can't be a support for the child. And so not just stopping the conversation at, no, I'm not interested in placement. And our CPS worker goes, okay, great, thanks, bye, because they've got 7 million other things to do. But stopping and saying, okay, if you don't feel like placement's possible, what can you provide? Do you want to remain involved? Can you remain a support for this child? Because it's not just a placement that we need a whole network of support for this child. And so it provides an opportunity for them to be involved in other ways, but that's definitely a shift in mindset from our staff.
For sure. We hear that so many places, just when we say kinship care, right? We're not just thinking about identifying that singular kin caregiver for placement. We're thinking about a system or a network building approach. And that is a shift from what oftentimes staff have been asked to do or have thought about in the past. That's a great example. And then I'm hearing you say also you have that as part of that larger conversation in your meetings. And I'm curious with that. Actually, I would love to like rewind and hear you tell a little bit about in setting these up. Give us like a sneak peek from behind the scenes. How did that go? Obviously, this is something new and different. What were folks' impressions of this at first? So what sort of work did you have to do to kind of lay the foundation to start having these regular meetings?
It was bumpy at first, to be honest. I think we had, of course, voiced to our staff what was happening. The way our setup is in Michigan, we are about like 60% privatized on the foster care side. So CPS is handled by the state only, and then foster care is handled by both state workers and by private agency workers. And so it's a lot of people to get that message out to. And there was a lot of, when we were first sending the emails, like people were like, what is this? Why are you sending me a thing about this meeting? I don't know what this is for. There was a lot of no-shows. So we had to do a lot of legwork on the front end of continuing to reach out and message what these meetings were, why they were occurring, the importance of them, and then also doing a lot of legwork on like contacting everyone in advance of the meetings to be like, hey, you received this calendar invite. Here's what it's for. Your meeting, like your attendance on there is not optional. It's imperative that you're on there. We have all different levels of management on there. They're run by our data analyst team, but we have the supervisors on there, the section manager. We have all levels of management on there, just trying to show that this isn't just something we're expecting the supervisors to run, that management feels this is important and is taking the time aside for this as well. And also people tend to be a little bit more concerned about skipping a meeting when you've got higher levels of management on the call. But we had to do a lot of legwork initially to get people there. CPS tended to just be like, I've passed the case off to foster care. Why do you still need me to be here to talk about this placement? Like, this is stupid. You're wasting my time. So there was a lot of educating that had to go on behind the scenes in the messaging of what this was, reminding staff of the importance of it, and then making sure that they were going to be present on the meetings. And we would always send out in advance what kids were on the agenda so they knew who was going to be on there. And we would list a little bit of like what, if there was any specific follow-up that had been discussed on a prior call, what specific follow-up we were going to be circling back to on the upcoming call. So that way people knew what to prepare. And at the end of the meetings, we would also send out like a summary of each kid that was discussed on the call, what follow-up was needed. So that way everyone was on the same page about what we were going to be looking to discuss the next time. It got easier with time as people kind of got used to it, but it definitely it was rough at first. There was a lot of no shows on the calls and having to scramble to get people on the call at the last minute, but it got better with time, but it took a couple of months for people to get the hang of it.
And I'm struck by how you shared, or even in your story about grandma, you said they were on the agenda, that story or that case was on the agenda for 6 months. Like just the fact, like you keep coming back, right? This is something you continue to check in and support. This isn't just a one and done, like, all right, we talked about this. There's follow-up, there's follow through.
Yes.
That seems really key. And I'm also Jody in the chat asked, could you say one more time or just share who all is attending these monthly meetings?
Yeah, so we have data analysts who it's a position that we have. So we had them running the meetings, but we also had the assigned worker both on the foster care and the CPS side on the call, both the CPS supervisor and foster care supervisor on the call. That's to say, if CPS would be involved if it was relatively close to removal. If we were talking about a case that had been in foster care for a year and there wasn't much CPS was going to provide at this point, then we wouldn't include them. But typically, if we were talking about kids where removal had happened recently, we had the CPS supervisor and worker present as well. And then we would also have our section managers and our district managers on there as well. So we had pretty much all levels of staff in the office and management present on the call. And then also we usually had our kinship support supervisor on the call. They're our unit who does all of the relative assessments for the home assessments, and they also provide our kinship caregivers. So we had our kinship supervisor on the call as well, so they could jump in and assist or discuss what kinship could provide as supports.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I'm curious, one final follow-up question. Okay, so you talked about in terms of how to get folks in the room, but I'm curious in terms of, I think this sort of setting could go two different ways, right? This could come up as you're coming in to defend, right? You're coming in to tell why this placement didn't happen or why it's hard. And that could feel, especially if there's leadership or management in the room, right? So you have this trade-off of wanting to relay that it's important, and that's why all lines of management are there, but also that changes the tone or setting in the room. How are you building, or how have you built a collaborative spirit in which folks know we're coming together to troubleshoot, we're coming together to bust barriers together. We're not coming for you to report out and for us to point fingers.
I'm glad you said that, because that was definitely one of the things we ran into initially. I think CPS was coming in very defensive, like they had to justify why the kid wasn't placed with kin. And while yes, we want to know the reasons why the kid wasn't placed with kin in terms of were there people who were identified and there were barriers, but we're not asking for them to like justify the decisions that were made. The decisions have been made at this point, and we're not really here to pick apart those decisions. And so that was part of a lot of what we had to do with on the education side with our CPS staff. Like, we are having these meetings because we feel it is so important for kids to be placed with kin. We really hit hard on the data outcomes showing how much more stable kids are in kin placements, and that this is something that affects this kid throughout the course of their time involved with our system. This is not something that has short-term effects on them. And so that this is why we are really prioritizing this, and that we are using this as a collaborative opportunity to try to figure out what we can do moving forward to see if it's possible to place this kid with kin. There is so much information that is typically lost in the handoff from CPS to foster care. It's a chaotic time. There's so much going on, and CPS kind of has a tendency to share the nuts and the bolts of the investigation, why we removed, what the safety issues were, what the parent needs to have in their treatment plan, what we need to focus on with the family. That sometimes some of those issues of, hey, we talked to two grandmas and two aunts and an uncle, and this is why we couldn't place, or someone said to circle back with them in a couple months about placement because they're recovering from surgery, or just whatever the myriad of issues possibly could be. A lot of that information tends to be lost in that handoff from CPS to foster care. And so this kind of provided a structured opportunity for us to make sure that all of those little bits of information made it over to foster care so they could continue to follow up with that. And so we just had to really work on our messaging and explaining to our CPS staff why we were prioritizing this, and that it was not something that we were intending to be punitive or pick apart the decision that was made. We just really feel that it's this important that we try to figure out if this is possible moving forward.
That's great. That's a great example. I'm curious if, let's see. Okay, we have another question here. I was going to call for final questions for Jennifer, but about if you could talk a little bit more about the kinship data that you're referring to in terms of this process, what you're pooling, what you're using in the meeting.
The data as it relates to the outcomes for kids, or the data for the meetings?
Termiel, do you want to come outcomes? Okay, outcomes.
Okay. So Michigan worked with the Government Performance Lab for probably about a year or two, a couple of years ago. It was, I want to say around 2020, 2021 maybe was when it first started.
Back in the day is what we're saying.
Yes, it was a while ago at this point. But with that, part of what we started to do was we had our data analysts involved, and then the staff, the GPL staff were heavily involved in this as well, that we started collecting a lot more data around our removals that were occurring, the types of placement kids went into at the time of removal, and then outcomes for those kids. So we started collecting data on, for kids who weren't placed with kin, what those barriers to placement with kin were. And then for the kids who were placed with kin, we were then able to compare the data for the kids placed with kin in terms of replacements that were occurring, placement disruptions. A lot of that we were able to track. In Michigan, our system is set up where we have to have these formal team decision-making meetings if there is a considered placement disruption or a placement disruption. So we were able to track some of the placement disruptions through, or the considered placement disruptions through that occurred. And so looking at the number of placement disruptions that were occurring for these kids, mental health services being offered to these kids, so like services that they needed and were in place. So we were able to kind of compare the kids who were placed with kin to kids who were not placed with kin, which was where we were able to come up with the data about the overall stability being so much better for kids who were placed in kin care.
That's great, Jennifer. And I was either way going to share this out at the end of the call. I will go ahead and drop a link here. This is the link to the GPL's Kin First Management page, in which there's a publication around some of these management strategies, including building and maintaining ongoing kin search for kin. And even some of the examples that folks shared today, there's some tools and pieces that are highlighting this work, such as examples of what a kin meeting to review and discuss could look like. But another piece of what we do, like Jennifer mentioned, is thinking about data-driven performance management techniques in relation to tracking kin placements and what that can tell us about where to focus our work and effort. So things that Jennifer just named, right, in terms of if we're tracking placement stability and kin placements versus not, if we're often seeing that kin placements overall are much more stable. If you are thinking about how it's challenging to message this to staff, that's something everyone wants, right? And so some of those examples too of thinking about using data to inform messaging around this work, and also in terms of thinking about things like, oh, when we talk about ongoing kin search, do we need to really prioritize this? Because it turns out actually a pretty low percentage of our kin placements are happening initially. Most of them are happening later. If we break down our data and see this, it can help us figure out what to do about it. So those are some great examples. And feel free, all of these resources that are linked here are free and downloadable. I'm curious, as we wrap up, thank you to all of our speakers today. I want to do a final call for questions for anyone. We've got five minutes for whatever we need to discuss here. Anyone have a question or anything else come up that you want to ask or share?
Hi. Hi, I would love to ask a question. I serve on the Idaho's Child Welfare Advisory Board for their internal review board that reviews their PIP, and so I'm just looking if there's a recommendation. I know that this isn't Idaho specific, but if there's any recommendations that you would have for a board like that, could anybody give me something to bring to that?
You mean in terms of an actual tool of how to review and discuss?
Yeah, something to implement or something to
Yeah.
bring to their attention while I have the, ear of the division administrators.
Elizabeth, I'd be happy to follow up with you with a few links or ideas. But before I do, I'm curious, any of our speakers, anything that you all shared or thinking about that you feel like might connect well here? Thank you, Anna. So go ahead, Jennifer.
I was just, and I don't know what the culture is like. I think you said Idaho. In Michigan, we are incredibly data driven. Like we look at data till your eyes bleed. And so I think one of the things that really helped was push further KIN initiatives along was the data that we were able to collect with the Government Performance Lab. And that's not to say that we would not have been able to collect that data on our own, but kind of our work with the GPL brought the importance of that data to the forefront. And then once we had that data, it made it very easy for us to share it with leadership within central office to push other KIN initiatives along. And so I would say the data that we obtained from when we started looking at the kinship outcomes from our work with the GPL is data that we continue to refer back to and data that we have used to advocate for other kinship programs. And so that I feel like was really one of the main jumping off points for us because everything in child welfare is so tied to funding and outcomes. And so for us to be able to say, this is why this is important, this is how much it impacts these kids in a positive way, and the impact that we can have with less placement disruptions and just greater overall stability, that really allowed us to better advocate moving forward for additional kinship support programs. So that was a really good place for us to start at least.
Thank you.
That's a great example, Jennifer. And I would say also Anna dropped in the link to the KIN Finding Toolkit and supports that you might enjoy digging through and finding some additional things. I also wanted to say, Elizabeth, that in addition to the main link that I shared, there's a lot of things on that page. One, dig through, but see what else looks interesting. But one of the pieces that we have there is about building a KIN first communication strategy. And so it's just a simple worksheet or exercise that I can imagine your team could go through together to pull some of those pieces that Jennifer just gave in relation to what you have. What is the data saying? Who's the group that we're meeting with specifically? What are they looking for to craft your message around? That might feel nice as well.
So crib, diapers, carrier.
All right, I think we are about at time. Thank you all
Thank
for
you so much, Emma, for leading this today. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
No,
Go
no,
ahead.
no, go for it. I didn't realize you were still here.
I'm still here. Yeah. Melissa Devlin, our assistant director, is usually on at this time, but she asked me to step in and just thank you for leading this session. And know for those of you who may be joining the first time that there is a series of these around one session for each of the strategies that are in the network's KIN Finding Toolkit that was prepared by Marina Nitsa, one of our subject matter experts. So I did drop that link in the chat, and the recording from today's session will be on there as well, likely by the end of the week. Thank you again, Emma.
Thank you all, and thank you for all of our speakers today. We appreciate you. All right.
Indeed.
Thanks. Take care.